How do you tell a story? How do you get from the beginning to the middle to the end effectively and without boring the audience? These questions are essentially the bane of any aspiring filmmaker's existence, and as an aspiring filmmaker myself, I wanted to delve into the creation of compelling characters and plots to figure out how exactly someone can tell a compelling story. There's obviously millions of techniques to use in telling a story, so I'm only going to be touching on the very basics in this video. But if I get enough support, I might continue this as a series and talk about more intermediate topics like visual storytelling, camera angles, and lighting. I've spent a lot of time researching for this video, and I can definitely say I've learned a lot about storytelling in general. So please enjoy the video and beware spoilers for the following. What is a compelling protagonist? Contrary to popular belief, a protagonist doesn't always have to be the hero of the story. It can sometimes be the villain or a side character that gets caught up in the conflict. Sometimes the protagonist doesn't even win, and there is no happy ending for them. But no matter what role the protagonist plays in the story, the most compelling have flaws that serve as obstacles in the way of their goals, and they have a strength that can give them hope to persevere. Without flaws and strengths that directly affect the conflict, the main character suddenly becomes stale and uninteresting. A protagonist that is flawless is often referred to as a Mary Sue. These characters are physically attractive, exceptionally skilled, loved by everyone, and none of their actions have any real consequences. They feel more like characters from a poorly written fanfiction than an actual person. Luke Skywalker is constantly tempted by the dark side. Peter Parker is a normal teenager that makes normal human mistakes. Batman's vigilantism literally feeds the crime in Gotham City, and it's only when he steps down as the Caped Crusader that crime actually starts to decrease. No real person is flawless, and on the other side of the coin, no real person lacks a strength.
The truth is, I am Iron Man.
An example of a great film protagonist is Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man. In the first movie he ever appeared in, Tony Stark was a greedy, narcissistic playboy whose family business literally sold weapons to foreign terrorists. How could someone so unlikable be a compelling protagonist? He went from a narcissistic playboy to a genuinely altruistic man faced with the consequences of his actions, to a broken man with PTSD who realized he couldn't protect the Earth by himself, to someone who, once again, had to face the consequences of his actions after the robot he created killed thousands of people. Tony Stark fails, and learns, then fails again. His story is a tale of a normal dude who just wants to do good in the world, but every time he tries to do good, he is faced with the consequences of his failures. But even with his failures, his intelligence and determination allow him to persevere in the pursuit of his goals. This is exactly why Tony Stark is such a compelling protagonist, someone who resonates with the audience, and makes people feel exactly what he's feeling. But what about the antagonist?
Wait. You could not live with your own failure. Where did that bring you? Back to me.
The villain should be able to fill the role of a protagonist. If the villain was the star of his or her own movie, could they be someone that the audience could root for? The villain of any story must have strengths and flaws of their own, and their motivations should leave them feeling like real people. For example, people love Thanos because his villainous acts are selfless. He kills people because he believes that his actions genuinely benefit others. Infinity War is most often seen as Thanos' movie, and the villain himself, someone who seems the most human and vulnerable despite being an intergalactic warlord descended from celestial gods, Thanos is undoubtedly the best villain in the entire MCU, but not all characters have to be selfless to fill a protagonistic role. There's actually one more thing that most filmmakers fail at when creating their villains. The antagonist should only work against the protagonist. The story shouldn't just be big muscular good guy versus big muscular evil guy. We need to have a reason for these two characters to be connected in some way. And this is something that Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker in The Dark Knight excels at.
My father was a drinker and a fiend.
The Joker is defined by his pursuit of chaos, striving to prove that what lies beneath every human skin is immorality, and that even the heart of Gotham could succumb to his inner demons and give up his morals on a bad day. At the same time, Batman is defined by his brutal pursuit of justice and his unwillingness to kill.
You didn't think I'd risk losing the battle for Gotham's soul in a fist fight with you.
The Joker doesn't just stand in the way of Batman's goals, and the vice versa isn't the only thing happening either. They both stand in the way of each other's goals. They're both fighting for the soul of Gotham City, something that won't be resolved in a simple fistfight.
I told you what happened to your father.
He told me enough. He told me you killed him.
No. I am your father.
Darth Vader, who is often considered the best movie villain of all time, is another prime example of this technique. He's intelligent, confident, physically imposing, but being the father of our protagonist Luke Skywalker does way more than just creating dramatic tension. Throughout the story, Luke subtly shows hints that he's tempted by the dark side, consistently acting out of anger more and more during the events of The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Even the clothing he wears signals drastic changes from movie to movie. Darth Vader himself once walked down a similar pathway, fueled by similar emotions, and his continuous efforts to turn his son to the dark side divulges a striking parallel between the two.
Never join you!
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Anakin is a representation of what Luke will end up as if he doesn't resist the dark side, and it's this psychological connection that makes the conflict between these two characters work. If you can swap out your villain for any other villain in fiction, your antagonist probably needs some adjustments.
Stop! Boom! Protect! Emotion, anger! And fireball! And fireball!
Protagonists and antagonists are often the ones in the limelight, since they are considered the most important characters, but there's a surprising impact that secondary characters have on the overall story that often gets overlooked. Every good secondary character has a purpose and is thrown to the situation for a reason. They can be mentors like Obi-Wan Kenobi or Dumbledore, or they can be the protagonist's friends who help him or her on their journey like Ron and Hermione or Han and Leia. Stories are only as strong as their weakest characters. Those who have an interesting personality and their own sense of character, as well as a reason to be in the story in the first place, are as important as the main character in the story's development. If you could cut a secondary character out of a story and the plot would remain completely unchanged, then why introduce the character in the first place? Secondary characters must be the independent variable that changes the world around the main character as the events of the movie play out. And that leads me to the next part of today's video. How do you develop an interesting plot? Something that'll hook your audience and keep them hooked for the entirety of the movie. Before you write down a single line of dialogue, the filmmaker must decide the central conflict of the movie, how the flaws and strengths of the characters affect the conflict, and the stakes that arise from the conflict. Whether your story is a comedy, a tragedy, or an action-packed thriller, your conflict needs stakes that matter. Greater stakes equal a less boring story. But greater stakes doesn't always mean the world is in trouble or the universe is in trouble. A comedy about a handful of kids struggling to come to terms with the fact that they're growing apart can have stakes as dramatic and even entertaining as a superhero defending the planet from alien invaders. Greater stakes mean that failure brings consequences that threaten the protagonist's goals or what they care about. A superhero defending the Earth is cool, but why exactly does it matter? The hero's journey is a common template that writers use when developing the plot of a movie, and despite its name, it doesn't necessarily have to revolve around a hero. This template can be used in comedy, romance, and literally any genre.
It's a circular pattern. It's got three basic parts: separation, initiation, and return.
In a 3 to 4 act screenplay, it's easy to divide parts of your movie as shown to further organize your thoughts and scenes into something similar to blocks. First, you have a prologue, or the beginning of the movie that sort of tells the mood of what you're about to see before the title screen is even shown. The first act of the hero's journey is often called the departure, which usually takes up the entirety of the exposition, where all characters, conflicts, and stakes are explained. First, we peek at the ordinary life of the protagonist before the conflict arises. How does this character perceive the world around them? Then suddenly something changes in the protagonist's life that sparks the beginning of the adventure, and they're finally faced with the conflict. In the second act of the hero's journey, often called the Road of Trials, the protagonist uses his strengths to overcome several trials in his or her pursuit of a resolution to the conflict. In every turning point, dramatic tension is built up, the stakes are raised, or something emotional happens to the character that drastically changes the outlook of the story, or the future is generally unknown and unpredictable. Something keeps causing the tension to rise, and that will eventually make the climax even more satisfying. Often, the character's flaws cause them to fail a few trials, but the protagonist is eventually forced to learn something throughout their journey in order to finally tackle the conflict once and for all in the third act. After the protagonist resolves their problems, they return to their normal life with the knowledge gained from their journey, and a new chapter of their life starts to unfold. All loose ends are tied up, and the movie officially ends.
My mom always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get.
Throughout the plot, every single major character undergoes a personal journey called the character arc. This is the transition between who the character is in the beginning and who the character is toward the end. There are generally 4 types of basic character arcs, 2 of which are dynamic, meaning the character progressively changes over the course of the story, and 2 of them are static, meaning the character barely changes whatsoever. There's the dynamic positive arc, where the character overcomes their flaws and ends up in a better situation than where they began. Then there's the dynamic negative arc, where the character fails to overcome their flaws and ends up in a worse situation than where they began. There's the flat positive arc, where the character stays the same throughout the story, but they generally change the characters around them in a positive way. And finally, there's the flat negative arc, where the character stays the same throughout the story, but instead of changing the characters around them in a positive way, they typically change them in a negative way. When a dynamic character undergoes a positive or negative character arc, the change usually comes from a lie the character believes. The character lacks something in their life internally, stemming from a misconception about their self and or the world around them. Maybe they believe money is the key to happiness, or the strong will always overpower the weak. For example, Thanos believes that wiping out half the universe's population will be a benefit to those who survive. Unlike the audience, the character doesn't really know that their lie is wrong. There's an ongoing conflict between what the character wants and what the character needs. They want a perceived cure to the symptoms of the lie, but in reality, they need the truth. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, Zuko believes that honor is everything. He wants to capture the Avatar and restore his honor he lost when he challenged his abusive father, but in reality, he only undergoes a positive character arc when he chooses to help the Avatar restore balance in the remaining 3 kingdoms. This is a great example of a dynamic positive character arc. On the other side of the coin, Anakin Skywalker began his journey in a state of powerlessness and overwhelming emotions that he wasn't allowed to process. This created a thirst for power in order to prevent losing his loved ones, and he was eventually led into the arms of Darth Sidious. However, in his blind pursuit of power, he lost everyone he cared about, and the person he used to be was long gone. Sometimes characters don't undergo any changes themselves, and instead change others, resulting in a static character arc. Although protagonists and antagonists that change throughout the story are definitely compelling, there are plenty of examples of great main characters that stay the same. Anakin Skywalker only falls to the dark side because Emperor Palpatine convinced him that doing so would ultimately prevent the death of his wife Padme. Even until the end, Palpatine remains a cunning and calculated man of pure evil. Nothing really changes that about him. He ends in the same place he began.
Believe me, my heart is exceptionally pure. Pure evil to the core.
In the Dragon Ball franchise, the protagonist Goku is an excellent example of a flat positive character. He continuously changes those around him for the better, despite never really changing himself all that much. Piccolo and Vegeta were both enemies of Goku who believed that power was the only important thing in life, but Goku ultimately allowed them to realize that family and friends were way more valuable than strength.
Goodbye to you all. Bulma, Trunks, and yes, even you, Kakarot.
The compelling part of Goku's story is his ability to cause other characters to undergo dynamic character arcs. There are still lots of character development in Dragon Ball's nearly 34-year run, but Goku is the cause of these changes rather than the character experiencing them. Thank you guys for watching. I spent the past couple of months on this video and I really believe I made something great. Honestly, the best way to begin a career in filmmaking is to watch as many movies as possible and pay attention to the subtle techniques they use. Make sure you watch a couple of movies this weekend with your friends, sit back and relax. As always, I'm Caleb, and this is How to Tell a Story.